And this show's going to be a little different format than they usually are.
Hey, poor! Hey, poor! Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, not far from the redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is in my lap demanding attention, and Ash is curled up on my bed. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cats. Get over it. This is a news show episode where I cover stories in the news that are related to things like atheism, secularism, science, or I find just plain interesting. Next episode will be a chapter or two from the Ethiopian Apocrypha. Okay, folks. We are just 2 weeks away from the most important election of this century. I know that many of you are thinking there's little we can do but wait for election day and hope. This is not true at all. There is a lot we can do between now and then. I'll start with the easy stuff first. Find out who the Democratic candidates in your area are and share the shit out of their information on social media. Tag your friends who live close to you in those posts. Many people have no idea of who is running, and sharing that information will let them know. Tagging your friends not only will help ensure that they see this information, but increase the chances that they vote in the election. You can also volunteer to help a campaign. They need people to help with mailing out campaign literature, make phone calls, knock on doors, or pass out material in places like stores. Heck, just find out where and when a candidate is holding an event and show up. Or if you really want to impress folks, bring food or drinks to the event. The last one can really have an oversized impact on the campaign because it is a huge morale boost for folks at a time when they need it the most. Excitement is infectious, and the more excited a campaign worker is, the more likely they'll spread their enthusiasm to people, and then those people are more likely to vote. Remember, the lives of people you know and love are depending upon the outcome of this election. I have a number of friends in the LGBTQ community. Their lives and livelihoods are threatened by the Republicans. No matter the results of this election, I wouldn't be able to look people like Callie Wright, Tris Mamone, Marissa McCool, and far too many others to mention in the eye and say I did everything I could to help them if I just sat on my hands between now and election day. The same is true of the women and people of color that I know. The threats against them are almost as grave as those who are LGBTQ. You do not have to passively wait for election day to help them. You can take steps now that will positively impact their lives. I'm sure that if all of you found yourself back in time with the family of Anne Frank at your door seeking shelter, you wouldn't hesitate to bring them inside and hide them regardless of the cost. How much better would it be to go back a little further in time and take the steps necessary to prevent the events which caused her family to have to seek shelter? You can do that now by getting involved. Some of you, no doubt, have complaints about the Democratic Party. You don't think that they're pushing hard enough for a change, that they're not doing enough to stand up against Trump or the oligarchs. I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm merely going to point out that if you're not actively telling them this, if you're not showing up to meetings, if you're not engaging the Democratic candidates on this matter, they have no way of knowing what you think. Lots of people say that if you don't vote, you don't have the right to complain about election results. Well, you know what? If you're not engaged with the Democratic Party, you don't have the right to complain about what they're doing. After the 2016 election, I made an effort to seek out and find the Democratic Party in my area because I nearly lost everything when Bush was in office, and I wasn't willing to sit idly by and let that happen to me again. I knew that if I was to have any hope of not being homeless, it was by my getting involved. And in that time, I have seen changes in how my local party has handled things. Not all of it has been what I wanted, and they haven't changed as much as I would have liked, but there has been progress, and I don't know if that would have happened if I hadn't decided to show up, go to meetings, and voice my opinion. And for those of you who live in a solidly blue area, who know that your elected officials are all going to be Democrats, there are still ways you can help change things for the rest of us. Message me if you're willing to make phone calls, and I will put you in touch with the Democratic campaigns in this very red state who would love for you to make calls on their behalf, or accept a donation from you. A single dollar might not sound like much, but that's the price of a postcard which can be sent to a voter. It's a drink for a thirsty volunteer. It's a ray of hope showing that someone cares to a candidate who thinks they cannot win. No matter what happens, if you get involved now, you are helping to build a network to improve the skills of candidates and campaign workers, and perhaps most important of all, to provide hope for people, which is going to be desperately needed in 2020. The groundwork for who the next president is going to be is being laid now. If you want to have the most to say about what kind of president that will be, the time to act is now, not in 2020. And for those of you who are outside of the U.S., there are things which you can do to help. It is technically illegal for you to mail money to, say, a U.S. citizen and have them give that exact same dollar amount to a U.S. candidate. So don't do that. Don't do that. That would be very suspicious. And, when somebody does that in large amounts, that occasionally gets investigated. So don't do that. There are organizations which are desperately working to protect the rights of Americans and stop what is happening, like the American Civil Liberties Union. Again, they could use a donation. GLAAD with 2 A's is another organization that works to protect the rights of those in the LGBT community. They could certainly use a donation. And lest anyone out there think that I'm not putting my money where my mouth is, I certainly am. I have donated to the Democratic Party, the various campaigns. I spent Sunday volunteering and filling out envelopes for a Democratic candidate who's not even one I can vote for. So, if I can do that without a car, surely you guys out there can do something. As Dylan Thomas said, do not go gentle into that good night, but rage, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And that is what I'm doing. I hope all of you out there will do the same. Okay, so now that I've gotten that out of the way, I'm having to do this on the fly because, well, I had a busy weekend, as you could tell. And in addition to helping a Democratic candidate, I and another gentleman worked on a project together that in the next week or two, the Patreon listeners will get an advanced preview of what's coming. I've mentioned in the past that I plan to do another podcast, and I found someone who's willing to do it with me, and we cut the first episode. We'll be cutting more episodes here in the near future, and the Patreon listeners will get to hear the raw version of that episode this week. The rest of you will have to wait until after the first of the year. I think that's all the really big news I have. Well, the one news I have, which is big in the sense that it's going to impact me, but it's not big in the sense that it's good or exciting, is for whatever reason, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's obviously something that they do all the time and haven't bothered to inform people that they do this all the time. We just sort of have to figure it out. I will be off work, unpaid, the last week of this month, which half of it is October and half of it is November. So that sucks. I have not been working there long enough to be able to file unemployment for that time period, and I know that I will be off the last 2 weeks of December. So money's going to be a little thin for me till the beginning of next year, it looks like. But I have figured out what their pattern is of when we get these long weeks off. And next year, when they do it, I should be able to file for unemployment, or at least I'll have vacation time I can put in for during those weeks, some of those weeks, so I can get paid for it and I'm not floundering around. And it is those weeks that I really appreciate the Patreon supporters of the podcast, because while the money I bring in isn't as much as a week's pay, it is better than nothing at all. But the good news about figuring all this out is that I now know I have about 6 weeks off from this job a year, including my vacation time. Which, that's not too bad. Knowing roughly when they fall means that I can plan things for next year. I can say, well, since I know I'm going to be off the week of the 4th, get some shit so that while I'm off, I can take care of some stuff around the house. The last 2 weeks of December, I already know we're going to be off then, so I can, take care of some things inside the house. It'll probably be too cold to do much outside. Although with global warming, who the hell knows? All right, with that out of the way, let's get to the news.
Have I helped your unbelief?
Oh, yes. Yes, I believe. I believe in death. I believe in disease. I believe in injustice and inhumanity and torture and anger and hate. I believe in murder. I believe in pain. I believe in cruelty and infidelity. I believe in slime and stink, and in every crawling, putrid thing, every possible ugliness and corruption, you son of a bitch! I believe! In you.
From thehill.com. Federal prosecutors launch hotline for survivors of sexual abuse by clergy. The District of Columbia, U.S. Attorney's Office Victim Witness Assistant Unit, and the D.C. Superior Court Division's Sex Offense and Domestic Violence Section are launching a hotline and email for survivors of child sexual abuse by clergy to report the crimes. U.S. Attorney Jesse Liu on Monday announced that the victims or people with knowledge of incidents involving sexual abuse by clergy can contact the newly formed Clergy Abuse Reporting Line at area code 202-252-7008 or email usadc.reportclergyabuse@usdog.gov. A group of criminal prosecutors and victim advocates from the Superior Court Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office will review any information provided and decide if the provider can be given victim services or criminal charges can be issued. The victim advocates involved in the process can provide support and guidance to victims who report an incident. Now, this appears to be a nationwide line. So anyone in the U.S. can call, whether or not you're in D.C., and report. One hopes that this is a sign there is going to be widespread prosecution of abusers, and that their authorities are finally taking this seriously. We'll have to see. One never knows about these things. After all, you have the situation where, the Boston Globe's reporting should have been enough to trigger a national investigation, but it wasn't. However, it looks like with Boston and Philadelphia reporting wide-scale abuses, and next story comes from WashingtonPost.com. Justice Department investigates abuse by Catholic clergy in Pennsylvania. The Justice Department has launched an investigation into alleged sexual abuse of children by Catholic clergy across the state of Pennsylvania, a major escalation of government scrutiny of the church long sought by victims of pedophile priests. The decision to launch such a probe, even when limited to a single state, is noteworthy because the federal government has long shied away from tackling allegations that the church spent decades hiding the extent of the sexual abuse problem among its priests, and that it allowed pedophiles to continue to work and live undetected in communities. This is just a breathtaking, stunning, and very welcome development, says Michael Dulce, a lawyer who represents victims of sexual abuse. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia began issuing subpoenas recently, according to one person familiar with the matter. A spokeswoman for U.S. Attorney William McSwain declined to comment, but church officials around the state confirmed having received subpoenas. So, this appears to be a sign that they're getting serious, finally. Another sign. It's all we can do is hope and make sure that we elect people who are going to go after these things. From IndiaToday.in. Odisha. 9-year-old boy's head severed by his brother to appease goddess Durga. The Odisha police has claimed to solve the case of a 9-year-old boy whose severed head was recovered from a riverbed in Bolangir district. The victim, according to police, was murdered by his brother and uncle in order to appease the goddess Durga for the fulfillment of their wishes. We started the investigation suspecting it to be a case of human sacrifice. During the interrogation, one of the two accused confessed to the crime. Titlagara Subdivisional Police Officer Saraj Mohapatra told reporters. The incident took place on October 13th at Sundhimunda village, which comes under the jurisdiction of Sindhikala Police Station and Bolangir district. Religion kills. That's kind of all you can say about this. And, why you would want to worship a goddess who demanded human sacrifice, I have no idea. But people still do in the 21st century. This next story comes from independent.co.uk. World-famous Dead Sea Scrolls at Museum of the Bible are fake. 5 of the most valuable exhibits at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. have been found to be fake. The artifacts, thought to be part of the historic Dead Sea Scrolls, will no longer be displayed. Academics tested the fragments and found that Wow, that's poorly written. Academics tested the fragments and found that they show characteristics inconsistent with ancient origin and therefore will no longer be displayed at the museum, the institution said. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest copies of Bible text ever found and include passages of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament that range from 1800 to more than 2,000 years old. Though we had hoped the testing would render different results, this is an opportunity to educate the public on the importance of verifying the authenticity of rare biblical artifacts, the elaborate testing process undertaken, and our commitment to transparency, said Jeffrey Kolua, the chief curatorial officer for the Museum of the Bible, said in his statement. Now, I just want to point out that, these guys had been busted prior to this because they bought a whole bunch of artifacts which had been looted from Iraqi museums. And the people who sold them to the museum were almost certainly connected to groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So these guys really do not care where they get their shit from and who gets the money. And frankly, I'm surprised they actually bothered to test these fragments to see if they were genuine. That is something. But I'm awfully curious because they say they don't know who they got them from. So I'm real curious as to who they might have gotten them from. Were these fragments made by ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Iraq? And how much did you guys pay for them?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
From LiveScience.com, China may soon have a second artificial moon. Moonlit skies over the Chinese city of Chengdu may soon get a boost from a second moon. City officials recently announced plans to build an artificial moon, launching it to hang over Sichuan province's capital city by 2020, Chinese news site People's Daily Online reported. The illuminated orb is intended to complement the light of Earth's existing moon and will be 8 times brighter than the natural satellite. Wu Chengfeng, chairman of Chengdu Aerospace Science and Technology Microelectronics Systems Research Institute Company Limited, the primary contractor for the Chinese space program, told People's Daily Online. God, that's a mouthful for a business name. It's probably even worse in Chinese. Now, as somebody who knows a little bit about space, I have a lot of questions about this. First and foremost, and this is not what everybody in the article is talking about, is orbital mechanics make it a little difficult for that satellite or that artificial moon to stay where it is, directly above the city. Geosynchronous orbits, which is what you would need if you were just going to have that stay over the city all the time, have to be in an equatorial orbit. Chengdu is not near the equator. So I'm guessing that they're going to have this thing. I mean, they can put it in above the equator, directly below Chengdu, and then I guess maybe angle the light so it shines on Chengdu. I don't know if that's possible. It seems a little unlikely to me that they could do it that way, but you never know. If they're not doing it that way, then it's not, depending on the altitude, how high it up it is, will depend on how many orbits it makes of the Earth. The ISS makes an orbit of the Earth roughly once every 90 minutes. So if this was in an orbit similar to the ISS in terms of altitude, then it would be, going around the Earth, once every 90 minutes, and you'd have just a few minutes of illumination over the city. Again, I don't know. I mean, in theory, they could do station keeping, having thrusters keep it in position over Chengdu in an artificially made geosynchronous orbit, but that would be unstable. It wouldn't last very long. Now, and the article, the questions they ask in the article are like, well, has this gotten any kind of approval from the Chinese government? Nobody seems to know that. And they're also wondering what the impact is going to be on the wildlife in China, because even a little change in darkness levels can screw up the behaviors of nocturnal animals. Back in the 90s, the Russians tried to do this. They had a giant roll-up mirror that they put in space, which the plan was for it to be over. The plan was for them to be able to unfurl it and shine light in places like Siberia. And one of the arguments they made for it, and it wasn't going to be open continuously, so it wasn't always going to be shining light on Siberia, but one of the ideas they had for it, which actually is a pretty good idea, would be if there's some kind of disaster, they unfurl it and it shines the light on that area at night, making it easier for rescue workers to do their job. That's actually a great idea. Unfortunately, the mirror malfunctioned while it was in orbit, and it never worked right. I think it burned up shortly afterwards. But it's an interesting idea, and we'll just have to see if the Chinese are actually going to do this. I mean, they certainly are technologically capable of doing so. After all, most of your electronics are made in China, so they know how to make electronics, and they've shown they're capable of putting people and spacecraft in orbit. But this is a little more complicated, and again, we don't know, if this has got approval from the Chinese government or not. No idea the costs. Just have to see.
You bring them death, and they will love him for it.
Okay, now the big political news, of course, is the murder of the Washington Post journalist Khashoggi. Now, of course, the Saudis have changed their story as to exactly what has happened. And, at first they said, well, we don't know, he left, blah, blah, blah. And now they're supposedly saying, oh, well, gosh, what's happened is he died under interrogation. And there are reports, but so far as I know, no outside sources have heard the recordings. There are reports of recordings of Khashoggi being tortured and murdered. We don't know. I've seen stories that say U.S. intelligence officials who are speaking on background and thus unnamed have heard the recordings. But again, I don't know if that's accurate or not. I do know we ain't going to do shit about it. And also, let's be honest, the reason the Saudis knew they could get away with this was because of Trump and how closely tied they are to Trump. He has a lot of hotels in that part of the world and has a lot of business dealings with him. And, let's just say this had happened while Obama was president, which it would be unlikely to do. Obama wouldn't have done much either, because everybody has to kiss the Saudis' ass because they have oil. Even though the U.S. does not get very much oil from Saudi Arabia, our allies do, and some of our enemies do. So we like to keep close ties with them so we can control the flow of the oil. Now, what would have happened if what Obama most likely would have done is, yes, he would have given a strongly worded press release, but also there would be some kinds of sanctions. They would expel Saudi diplomats to the U.S. There would have been some kind of action which, while not the ideal, would have been better than what we've got now, which is basically nothing. And the reason, of course, why this is being made such a big deal out of is because the Saudis murdered a reporter. And reporters, like a lot of organizations, do not take kindly when one of their own is being killed. I know a lot of people have said, well, you know, the press is giving all this outrage over a murdered journalist, but they're not saying anything about the Saudis killing people in Yemen. Well, that's true. But there's not a lot of reporters in Yemen because it's a war zone, and they're, you know, our government, the Saudi government, the Yemeni government are basically keeping those people out, reporters out of there. And, you know, when I remember one time when I was a kid, I was talking to a cop, and I pointed out to him, I says, you know, you guys, you know, somebody can shoot me, and you guys don't do a lot to investigate it, but when somebody shoots a cop, you guys go hog wild to catch him. And the guy says, well, you're right, but think about it. If somebody's willing to kill a cop, they're willing to kill a lot of people. If they're willing to kill one individual, they may not be willing to kill a lot of people. And if somebody's willing to kill a reporter, they may be willing to kill lots of reporters. And, you know, the free press has to be protected if a society is to survive and to be informed of what's going on in the world. So it is understandable that the press is focusing on this issue. Certainly, it would be better if they put this much attention on a number of issues, not merely the death of one man, but, you know, this is, you know, on the positive, this is shining a light onto a lot of things that Saudi Arabia is doing, and is going to make it harder for other people to support them. There've already been, you know, there was a big conference that Saudi Arabia was having. It was supposed to be their version of Davos, and a lot of people have pulled out of it in the wake of this. So at least there is some response to it. You know, we won't see the end of theocratic rule in Saudi Arabia over it, but maybe we'll see a lessening of their power in the rest of the world. One can only hope. Now, other tidbits going on in the news. From NBCNews.com, Republicans outpacing Democrats in early voting in key states, NBC News finds. The data suggests enthusiasm among early GOP voters that could put a dent in Democratic hopes for a blue wave in the midterms. Is the blue wave turning purple? Republican-affiliated voters have outpaced Democratic-affiliated voters in early voting in 7 closely watched states, according to the data provided by TargetSmart and independently analyzed by the NBC News Data Analytics Lab. GOP-affiliated voters have surpassed Democratic-affiliated ones in early voting in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Montana, Tennessee, and Texas, the data showed. Only in Nevada have Democratic-affiliated voters exceeded Republican-affiliated voters so far in early voting, according to the data. Now, this sounds bad, but it's somewhat meaningless. Here's why. Republicans typically, and the article says this part here, but they don't give you the significance of it. Republicans typically dominate early voting by absentee ballots, while Democrats tend to have the advantage with in-person early voting. So, what this means is that in some states, not all of them, and I'll get to that, why that's the case in a minute, you can't really make a comparison because early voting, in-person early voting hasn't started yet. In other states like Tennessee, it is almost impossible to get an absentee ballot. I forget what the rules are, but you cannot just simply say, I need an absentee ballot because I'm going to be out of town on election day. There is a convoluted process you have to go through. And even if you are going to be out of town, there are certain things which they just will not justify giving you a ballot for you being out of town. I think, like, if it's a business trip, you can get a ballot, but if you're on vacation, you can't get a ballot. It is literally that petty. And absentee ballots are meaningless in many cases. Most elections, absentee ballots are never even counted. Because this is what they do. They look at the election, right? And if there's a race where you have candidate A is ahead by 1,000 votes of candidate B, and you have 500 absentee ballots, they don't count the absentee ballots because they will not change the outcome of the election. If, however, candidate A is ahead by 1,000 votes, and there are 5,000 absentee ballots, they will count some of them. If they get to a point where the absentee ballots are such that it overwhelmingly, that let's say there's 5,000 absentee ballots, candidate A is ahead by 1,000 votes, and 2,500 of the, we'll give it 3,000, 4,000 of the absentee ballots are for candidate B. They won't count the last 1,000 because those won't be enough to flip the election. So so the absentee balloting, those aren't anything to worry about. We also don't know who these people are voting for. We know they're Republicans, but we don't know who they're voting for. We know they've gone, we know they've voted. But again, we don't know who they voted for. That's kind of key, because some of them are probably voting for at least one Democratic candidate. Maybe not all of them, maybe not any of them, we don't know. And again, if you're in a state where absentee ballots can be sent in at any time, but you cannot do early voting except for, say, a week before the election, which is the case in some states, there's been no in-person early voting, which is where Democrats tend to dominate. And I'll go back to my screed at the beginning of this podcast. You do not have to sit on your hands and wait for Election Day. There are things you can do now to get out to vote. Another thing you can do, which I forgot, and I should mention now, call it. One of the things you can do is call a party and say, "Listen, if somebody needs a ride to the polls on Election Day, I'll be more than happy to drive them." They would love that. Do a search. There's a Facebook group for your preferred political party. Post in there, "Hey, if anybody in our area needs a ride to the polls on Election Day, I'll give you a ride." That will help. That can change things. And I know people say, well, one vote won't make a difference. That's actually not true. Because it has made a difference in the past, and a very important difference. The whole reason women have the right to vote in the U.S. comes down to one vote. And surprisingly enough, that one vote was cast by a Tennessee politician. Radiolab did a whole thing on this. The other thing is that when you call the party and say, "I want to give people rides to the election," they're not going to have just one person who needs a ride. They're going to have multiple people who need rides, probably. And it gives them a sense of support. They know that people are out there backing the party and caring and wanting to help. That is a big emotional boost, which they need right now, because as 538 points out, the polling for midterms elections is shit. It's worthless. We really have no idea how anybody is doing, because nobody is doing. Most elections, there are no polls being ran at all, and the few polls that are being ran aren't very good. So we don't have a clue as to how this election is going to turn out. So it's important we get everybody out to vote that we possibly can. Next story comes from lawandcrime.com. Mueller reportedly has recordings of Roger Stone in his possession. Special counsel Robert Mueller, as Law and Crime reported Friday, has been turning up the heat on former campaign advisor Roger Stone. Now CNN is reporting that Mueller has recordings of Stone in his possession. We already knew that former Stone aides Andrew Miller and Kristen Davis have been in the sights of the Mueller probe. The same is true of conspiracy theorist Jerome Corsi and Stone acquaintance Randy Credico. Despite Credico's incredulity about his plight, he has seemingly been a central figure when it comes to unraveling Stone's contact with WikiLeaks ahead of the 2016 hack of the DNC and the pursuit of dirt on then-candidate Hillary Clinton. Credico, you may recall, is the guy Stone reportedly asked to contact WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. According to CNN, however, Mueller's examination of all things Stone seeks to uncover whether Stone had back channels to WikiLeaks during the 2016 election that go beyond the Credico connection. To that end, the special counsel has reportedly obtained recordings in which Stone said he talked to Trump regularly early on in the campaign. In another piece of evidence, Stone allegedly expressed that he should receive credit for coordinating with WikiLeaks. Now, this is speculation. Again, we do not know if this is what happened. We do know, we do know that Trump and company were involved with WikiLeaks and the Russians and all that, but we don't know if Mueller actually has these recordings. Mueller keeps a very close watch on what gets out. So if this the sources of this, probably not Mueller's team. They're probably somebody connected to the administration or under investigation now, which means the veracity of the comments is suspect. It could be. And even if he does have them, we don't know what's in them. So while this is an interesting piece of information, it may not mean anything because it may not be true, or there may be nothing of value on those recordings. We don't know. Manafort reportedly has spent hours and hours talking to Mueller's team and giving them all kinds of information. That seems more promising as to lead to something like a conviction. And there are reports out now that Mueller is planning on submitting apparently his final report after the election. And people are, well, first of all, we haven't heard Mueller say this, so it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be true. Because almost from the start of the investigation, people in the Trump administration have been saying, we expect it to wrap up shortly. We expect it to wrap up shortly. And it's been going for like 18 months now. So I am inclined to take the claims that Mueller's got a report coming with a grain of salt. And even if he is, we don't know what it's going to be. And people are, saying, well, this, report needs to be released before the midterms. See, the official policy of the FBI, and Mueller ran the FBI, so he would adhere to it, is that they would not release such information less than 60 days ahead of an election because they don't want to be seen as influencing the election. Now, if this report is coming, and it was a bombshell report, unless there was overwhelming evidence of Trump's corruption in that. I mean, I don't mean just nailing a couple of people in the administration. I mean, you've got, the equivalent of video of Trump in a hotel room with a dead hooker. I can't see Mueller putting it out before the election, simply because again, he doesn't want to be seen as influencing the election, and it's not necessarily evidence which is going to prove beyond a reasonable doubt of Trump's guilt. Now, if it does have that kind of information, I would think that Mueller would want to put it out, simply because he would know that the odds of Trump being prosecuted when the Republicans control the government are nil. Whereas if he puts it out right before the election and people have a chance to see it, may flip both houses of Congress, and then there's a chance Trump could be prosecuted. I don't know. I have a feeling, though, it's a little early for Mueller to have that level of evidence, assuming it's out there, which I think it probably is. People forget how long the investigation into Watergate took. Mueller's gotten more indictments at this point than the Watergate investigation had when they were going after Nixon. So, this strikes me as a bit premature. I would think like sometime after the first of next year, you would see Mueller do that. Everybody describes him as Sphinx-like, because you never know what the man is thinking. You never, he doesn't reveal himself to you. Probably be a bitch to play poker against. So, I just, like I said, I can't see the stories of the reports being accurate. I may be wrong. If I am wrong, I hope that they are, that the report is some kind of preliminary report. It's not a final report. And there's more to come. Okay, on that convoluted note, I need to get out of here because it's almost time for me to go to work, and I want to get this edited and posted tonight before I go out, because tomorrow is exactly 2 weeks from the election. So, I thank all of you for listening. As I said, Patreon supporters, you'll get some bonus content later on this week. And the show notes will go up tomorrow, because I'm certainly not going to have time, I don't think, to get them up tonight, though I will try.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzz-Nuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.